This is the story of roughly 10,000 Canadian airmen who flew with RAF Bomber Command and never came home, and of why more than half of every death the Royal Canadian Air Force suffered in the entire war happened inside one single command. Canada pushed 72,835 aircrew through a training system it built from nothing, handed Bomber Command the only national group it ever contained, and buried close to a third of the men who flew in it. Start at the end. On the 31st of August 1945, the day number 6 group of RAF Bomber Command was formally stood down. Across 2 years and 8 months of operations, that group had flown 40,822 sorties, dropped 126,122 tons of bombs, and lost 814 aircraft, with around 5,700 airmen failing to return. Of those 5,700, somewhere between 4,203 and 4,272 were dead, and which figure you accept depends on which historian you happen to be reading. Roughly 3 out of every 4 men who did not come back were killed. Those numbers cover one group inside one command, and they leave out a great deal. They exclude the Canadians who flew with British squadrons, and there were more of those than there were Canadians in Canadian squadrons. They exclude the men killed at operational training units and heavy conversion units in England before they ever reached an operational posting, and they exclude the 856 trainees and instructors who died inside Canada without ever crossing the Atlantic. Assemble all of it and the total lands somewhere between 9,919 and 10,855. That spread has nothing to do with sloppy record keeping, because it comes from a definitional problem, and working out why the number refuses to hold still is the first thing that separates this account from the version most people have heard. The Canadian War Museum records 17,101 RCAF deaths across every command of the Second World War, covering Coastal Command, Fighter Command, Transport Work and Home Defense, the whole force in every theater. Measured against that total, Bomber Command accounts for well over half of it, which means one command and one kind of flying produced most of the dead. Put another way, the Royal Canadian Air Force lost more men over Germany than the Royal Canadian Navy lost anywhere at all across 6 years of war. Canadian War Museum figures give 2,024 naval dead and 22,917 Army dead, and the bomber offensive on its own accounts for roughly 10,000 of Canada's 42,042 total service deaths. What follows is what that cost bought, what it failed to buy, and the argument that has trailed the survivors for 80 years. Before any Canadian could die over the war, Canada had to build a machine capable of manufacturing airmen at industrial scale, and that machine carried the name British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. Signatures went onto it in Ottawa on the 17th of December 1939, barely 3 months into the war. The agreement is sometimes called the Riverdale Agreement, and Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand all put their names to it. Its logic was straightforward and fairly brutal, because Britain owned the aircraft and the war but did not own a single square mile of safe airspace in which to teach a man to fly. Canada offered enormous flat empty country, no enemy fighters anywhere above it, and a long border with a neutral industrial superpower willing to sell fuel and material. First recruits arrived on the 29th of April 1940, and the plan ran until the 31st of March 1945. Air Marshal Robert Leckie drew the appointment from the British Air Ministry in February 1940 to oversee the whole training effort inside Canada. The scale is the part most accounts skip straight past. At its peak, the plan operated 107 schools plus 184 ancillary units spread across 231 separate sites, employed 104,113 staff, and flew 10,906 aircraft, with those figures drawn from the Canadian Encyclopedia. Graduates numbered 131,553, covering pilots, navigators, bomb aimers, wireless operators, air gunners and flight engineers, and 72,835 of them were Canadian, according to the Plains Humanities Encyclopedia. The bill ran to $2.23 billion, settling finally at $2,231,129,039.26. Canada carried roughly $1.6 billion of that, precisely $1,617,958,108.79, close to 3/4 of the whole enterprise. Those are 1939 to 1945 Canadian dollars, and the currency year belongs attached to the figure, because without it the number tells you nothing at all. Here is a cross-domain comparison, offered as an analogy rather than as a historical claim. What Canada assembled between 1940 and 1945 was never really a school system, because it functioned as a throughput problem, structurally identical to what a modern high-volume manufacturer builds when a fixed number of finished units must leave the plant every month against an immovable deadline. Elementary flying training schools, service flying training schools, bombing and gunnery schools, air observer schools and wireless schools each occupied a station on that line, and every graduate moved through a fixed sequence of operations with an inspection waiting at each stage. The comparison holds in the uncomfortable direction as well, because every production line carries a scrap rate. This one recorded 856 trainees and instructors killed in training accidents inside Canada, a figure kept by the Royal Canadian Air Force itself. Those men died in Manitoba, in Saskatchewan, in Ontario, and in Alberta, flying aircraft that never carried a bomb, in a country no enemy aircraft ever reached. The plan also earned Canada a phrase that has clung to it ever since, when Canada was called the aerodrome of democracy. That description surfaced in a letter dated the 1st of January 1943, sent to Prime Minister Mackenzie King to mark the plan's third anniversary and signed by the President of the United States. But here is the thing about that letter, which is that its signatory did not write it. Lester B. Pearson drafted it, then serving as the number 2 at the Canadian Embassy in Washington and himself a future Prime Minister of Canada. Pearson set the whole business down plainly in his own memoirs, recording that on the 1st of January 1943 the Prime Minister of Canada received a very impressive letter lauding Canada as the aerodrome of democracy, drafted by Pearson and signed by the American President. Canada wrote its own commendation, posted it to Washington, and got it back with a signature on the bottom. That detail almost never survives into the popular telling. The figure of 131,553 graduates gets quoted so often that it has quietly stopped meaning anything, so it is worth slowing down on it. Break the number apart and it changes shape. The plan never trained 131,553 pilots, because it trained pilots, navigators, bomb aimers, wireless operators, air gunners and flight engineers, 6 distinct trades, each carrying its own syllabus, its own schools and its own washout rate. A heavy bomber crew drew 7 men from those trades, which meant the plan was never producing individuals at all. It was producing the components of crews. That explains why 107 schools were needed, with 184 ancillary units stacked on top of them across 231 sites, and why running the thing consumed 104,113 staff, a workforce larger than most Canadian cities of the period. It also explains why the plan absorbed 10,906 aircraft that were not fighting anybody. Sit with that aircraft figure on its own for a moment. The training plan held 10,906 aircraft on strength at its peak, while RAF Bomber Command lost 8,325 aircraft in action across the entire war. Canada was operating more aeroplanes for the purpose of instruction than Bomber Command lost in 6 years of combat. And Canada carried roughly $1.6 billion of the $2.23 billion total, in 1939 to 1945 currency, for a system whose entire output consisted of human beings trained to perform a job with a 44.4% death rate. The men who emerged from it crossed to Britain and were distributed. Some landed on Royal Canadian Air Force squadrons, rather more landed on Royal Air Force squadrons, and a considerable number never reached a squadron at all. That last group accounts for 1,498 of the eventual dead, killed at operational training units and heavy conversion units in England, flying worn-out aircraft handed down from frontline units, learning types they had never touched in Canada. 14% of the Canadian Bomber Command dead fall into that category, which works out at 1 in 7 Canadian bomber deaths occurring before the men ever reached an operational squadron. Add the 856 killed inside Canada during training and the total climbs into the thousands, all of them Canadian airmen who died in the process of being turned into aircrew, on both sides of the Atlantic, without ever flying a single operation. Nobody writes about that part, because it offers no target, no flak, no fighter and no citation. It amounts to a man dying in a Manitoba field in an Anson, or into a Yorkshire hillside in a tired Halifax, and it represents a large slice of the whole cost. The training plan arrived with a clause that shaped everything else about the Canadian Air War. Article 15 specified that Dominion aircrew were to be formed into national squadrons while remaining under Royal Air Force operational control. Under that clause, the Royal Canadian Air Force received the 400 series of squadron numbers, running from 400 to 449, while Australia and New Zealand drew their own blocks. Across the war, 44 Canadian Article 15 squadrons were raised, alongside 17 Australian and 6 New Zealand. That was the agreement on paper. Reality on the stations in England looked different, and the gap between the two generated friction for the entire war. In practice, the Royal Air Force posted Dominion aircrew wherever the Royal Air Force needed bodies. A trained navigator stepping off a ship in Britain went to whichever squadron had an empty navigator's seat, not to whichever squadron shared his passport. Technically that contravened Article 15, but it was also far simpler administratively, and Bomber Command was in the business of filling seats. Canada pushed back harder than the other Dominions did. The policy of concentrating Canadian aircrew into Canadian units acquired a name, Canadianization, and it settled into a running argument between Ottawa and London, while the Ralston-Sinclair Agreement stipulated 25 Royal Canadian Air Force squadrons to be raised over 18 months. Only Canada came away with a wholly national group commanded by its own Air Vice Marshal, because Australia never got one and neither did New Zealand. That achievement is the reason No. 6 Group exists as a subject at all. Canadianization nonetheless failed most of the men it was designed to cover, and the casualty figures demonstrate that more clearly than any policy document ever could. The Bomber Command Museum of Canada breaks the Canadian dead down by the kind of squadron they died on, and the figures run like this. Serving on Royal Air Force squadrons, 4,906 Canadians and Royal Canadian Air Force personnel were killed, which is 46% of the total. Serving on Royal Canadian Air Force squadrons, 4,255 were killed, or 39.9%. A further 1,498 died at operational training units and heavy conversion units, accounting for 14%. Read that distribution again, because it inverts the story everyone tells. More Canadians died in British squadrons than in Canadian ones, and roughly half the Canadian airmen killed in Bomber Command never served in a Canadian unit at any point. They flew under British squadron numbers, wore Canada shoulder flashes on a British station, and lie today under Royal Canadian Air Force headstones that give no hint of which squadron badge they served beneath. This is the first place where the popular version goes wrong. The story usually arrives as the story of No. 6 Group, because No. 6 Group is coherent, with a headquarters, commanders, a starting date and an ending date. The other half is diffuse and nearly impossible to narrate, since those men are scattered across dozens of British squadrons in ones and twos. How large was the Canadian presence overall? And here the sources disagree in a way worth stating rather than papering over. The Canadian Encyclopedia, writing about the Avro Lancaster, puts 1/3 of Bomber Command aircrew as Canadian. The Imperial War Museum frames it differently, saying 1 in 4 aircrew came from the Dominions collectively. Defining Moments Canada notes that the 72,835 Canadian graduates of the training plan amounted to just under a quarter of total Royal Air Force aircrew strength across its main combat commands. 1/4 to 1/3 is the honest range, and anybody offering a single confident figure has chosen a source without telling you which one. No. 6 Group came into being at Royal Air Force Linton on Ouse in Yorkshire on the 25th of October 1942, and on the 6th of December that year its headquarters shifted to Allerton Park, sometimes called Allerton Castle, sitting near Knaresborough and Harrogate in North Yorkshire. Allerton Park was a 75-room ancestral home belonging to Lord Mowbray, which meant the Royal Canadian Air Force ran its bomber war out of an English stately home. Operational status came on the 1st of January 1943, with the group flying its first operations on the night of the 3rd and 4th of January. No other national group existed inside RAF Bomber Command. Plenty of groups contained foreign aircrew and several had Dominion squadrons attached, but only this one was constituted as the Air Force of another country while operating under Royal Air Force Command. That structural oddity sat underneath everything that followed, including every argument about equipment, losses, and casualties. 8 squadrons formed the group at the start, rising to 14 at its peak, with 15 squadrons serving in it across its lifetime. One Royal Air Force source puts the figure at 13, a discrepancy worth flagging rather than quietly smoothing over. Stations spread across the Vale of York and South County Durham, at Middleton St. George, Linton-on-Ouse, Croft, Skipton-on-Swale, Tholthorpe, Leeming, Dishforth, Topcliffe, Eastmoor, Dalton, and Wimbledon, 11 airfields organized into 4 administrative bases. 2 men commanded the group across its existence. Air Vice Marshal George Eric Brooks took it from formation on the 25th of October 1942, and Air Vice Marshal Clifford Mackay McEwen took over on the 29th of February 1944. Known throughout the group as Black Mike, McEwen arrived and changed the group's survival statistics in ways that can be measured, which will matter considerably later in this account. One squadron stood apart from the beginning. 405 Squadron, the Vancouver Squadron, was the first Royal Canadian Air Force bomber squadron raised overseas, standing up at Driffield on the 23rd of April 1941, and it flew the Royal Canadian Air Force's opening bombing operation of the war on the night of the 12th and 13th of June 1941, against the marshalling yards at Schwedt. 408 Squadron, the Goose, followed on the 24th of June 1941 as the second. 405 Squadron did not remain with No. 6 Group. Transfer took it to No. 8 Group, the Pathfinder Force, the specialist target marking formation that flew ahead of the mainstream and lit the aiming point, which made 405 Squadron the only Royal Canadian Air Force unit in the Pathfinders and eventually produced the most decorated Canadian bomber pilot of the war. There is a detail buried in the squadron list that carries more weight than it first appears to, and it concerns what the Canadians chose to call themselves. An Article 15 Squadron was a Royal Canadian Air Force unit operating under Royal Air Force Command, on a British station, in British-supplied aircraft, inside a British command structure, flying operations planned in Britain. Almost nothing about the daily reality of the arrangement was Canadian, right down to the squadron number, which came out of a block allocated by London. What the squadrons could choose was the name. 405 Vancouver, 408 Goose, 415 Swordfish, 419 Moose, 420 Snowy Owl, 424 Tiger, 425 Alouette, 426 Thunderbird, 427 Lion, 428 Ghost, 429 Bison, 431 Iroquois, 432 Leaside, 433 Porcupine and 434 Bluenose. Consider that list, which offers a city on the Pacific coast, a goose, a moose, a snowy owl, a bison, a porcupine, and a thunderbird, alongside Leaside, a place in Ontario, and Bluenose, which is both a schooner and the word Nova Scotians use for themselves. Hardly any of those qualify as martial names. They name things that live in Canada, chosen by men living in Yorkshire, for units that would be dissolved the moment the war ended. 419 Squadron drew the Moose name from its first commanding officer, Wing Commander John Fulton of Kamloops in British Columbia, whose nickname was Moose, and the squadron motto reads Musa Asweda, which is Cree for Beware of the Moose. That squadron flew more sorties than any other in No. 6 Group, 3,645 of them, and lost 105 aircraft doing it. 425 Squadron, the Alouette, formed in June 1942 as the Royal Canadian Air Force's first Francophone unit, and spent the summer of 1943 in Tunisia as part of 331 Wing. Set all of that against the casualty breakdown one more time, because the contrast carries the point. On Royal Canadian Air Force squadrons, the ones flying under the Moose and the Porcupine and the Cree motto and the Alouette, 4,255 Canadians died. On Royal Air Force squadrons, with none of that attached to them, 4,906 died. The men killed in Canadian units died under a badge designed to remind them of somewhere else, while the larger number died under a badge that had nothing whatever to do with them, and both groups went home in identical telegrams. Ottawa and London fought over Canadianization for the entire war, and both sides were arguing about identity rather than about capability. The outcome, measured in the only currency that eventually counted, was that slightly more than half of Canada's Bomber Command dead never served in a Canadian squadron. 2 Canadian Air Vice Marshals commanded the only national group in RAF Bomber Command, running 11 airfields in the Vale of York and South County Durham from a 75-room English country house at Allerton Park. That was the fullest expression of Canadian control the war ever produced, and roughly half the Canadian dead fell outside it. 3 aircraft carried the Canadian bomber effort, and the differences between them decided who lived. First came the Vickers Wellington, a twin-engine bomber built on geodetic construction, a basket-work lattice of metal strips that let the airframe soak up damage which would have folded a conventional structure. Wellington served as the early workhorse of No. 6 Group, and the Mark 10 went to North Africa. Second came the Handley Page Halifax, a 4-engine heavy that No. 6 Group flew in larger numbers and for longer than any other group in the command. The Halifax arrived first as the Mark 2 and Mark 5, both of them disappointing, and then as the Mark 3, which amounted to a substantially different aircraft. Bristol Hercules radials replaced the earlier inline engines on the Mark 3, and performance improved dramatically. Third came the Avro Lancaster, with total production across Britain and Canada reaching 7,377 aircraft. Canada built its own version, the Lancaster Mark 10, at the Victory Aircraft Plant in Malton, Ontario. This is where the story turns contentious, and where the popular account needs correcting. The claim you will hear repeated, in comment sections and in more than a few documentaries, holds that Canadians were deliberately handed inferior aircraft, that the Royal Air Force hoarded Lancasters for British squadrons and pushed Halifaxes and worn-out Wellingtons onto the Colonials. The record supports the first half of that and not the second. No. 6 Group genuinely did operate older and less capable aircraft through much of 1943, flying Wellingtons and early Mark Halifaxes while other groups converted to Lancasters, and that much is documented. What the record does not support is the deliberate part, because Lancaster supply ran short across the whole of Bomber Command and re-equipment moved through the groups in sequence over time. Sources examining the question describe the modern debate over intentionally inferior aircraft as ill-informed. The distinction matters because the outcome landed identically either way. Canadian crews flew worse aircraft in 1943 and Canadian crews died at higher rates in 1943, which means motive changes the moral reading of it and changes the arithmetic not at all. And the arithmetic by aircraft type is stark. Hugh Halliday's statistics, published by the Bomber Command Museum of Canada, break Royal Canadian Air Force bomber casualties down by the machine the men died in. Halifaxes account for 3,675 dead at 32.8%, Lancasters for 3,349 at 29.9%, and Wellingtons for 2,586 at 23.1%. Below those come the Sterling with 523 at 4.7%, the Hampton with 296 at 2.7%, the Whitley with 280 at 2.5%, the Mosquito with 259, the Blenheim with 127 and the Manchester with 123, giving a total of 11,218. That total includes operations flown outside Bomber Command and includes Americans serving in the Royal Canadian Air Force, while excluding Canadians serving in the Royal Air Force. It is not the Bomber Command death toll, but a different slice of the same tragedy, and mixing the two together is how the public figures got confused in the first place. The Handley Page Halifax deserves separate examination, because No. 6 Group flew Halifaxes longer and in greater numbers than any other group, and because more Canadians died in Halifaxes than in anything else. Halliday's figures record 3,675 Royal Canadian Air Force bomber deaths in Halifaxes, or 32.8% of the total, which exceeds the Lancaster figure of 3,349 and comfortably exceeds the Wellington figure of 2,586. Three versions matter here. The Mark II and Mark V were the early aircraft, and they were what No. 6 Group had in 1943, through the Battle of the Ruhr, through the group's worst period of the entire war. The Mark III was a different machine, and the difference lived in the engines, where Bristol Hercules radials replaced the earlier inline units and performance improved dramatically. That word dramatically is doing real work in the sentence. Improving engine performance on a 4-engine bomber does not simply mean faster, because it raises the operating ceiling, which puts fewer aircraft inside the heavily defended altitude band. Better climb means less time spent slow and heavy on the outbound leg. More power margin means more room for violent evasive maneuver, which brings the corkscrew back into play. The corkscrew was the standard evasion against a German night fighter, a violent diving turn reversed again and again, designed to break the fighter's tracking solution and force him to give up. A crew that could corkscrew hard had a chance, while a crew flying an aircraft that grew unstable under hard maneuver did not. An operational research section report from July 1943 tied Halifax loss rates directly to training, and specifically to the type's instability in hard maneuvers. That finding cuts in two directions at once, because it identifies a handling problem in the aircraft while also identifying part of the problem as a training problem, and training problems can be solved by a commanding officer who decides to solve them. There is a version of this story where the Halifax is simply the bad aeroplane, the Lancaster is the good one, and the Canadians got stuck with the bad one. That version circulates most widely and it is not accurate. The Halifax killing Canadians through 1943 was the Mark II and the Mark V, while the Mark III that followed was a competitive frontline heavy bomber. And when the operational research section examined what happened to crews trying to escape a burning aircraft, the Halifax outperformed the Lancaster by close to 3-1, at 29.4% against 10.9%. The aircraft that flew worse turned out to be better at being abandoned. Whichever type a Canadian crew drew, that type arrived with a specific way of killing them and a specific way of not killing them, and neither was visible from the ground. A heavy bomber crew numbered 7 men, and every one of them performed a job that had not existed 25 years earlier. The pilot captained the aircraft regardless of rank, which meant a sergeant pilot commanded a machine carrying a flight lieutenant navigator, and nobody argued about it, because the alternative was chaos at 20,000 feet. Working at a curtained table with no view of the outside world, the navigator ran dead reckoning and radio fixes along a course deliberately bent into doglegs to disguise where the stream was actually heading. The bomb aimer lay prone in the nose above the bomb sight, holding the best and least useful view in the aircraft through the hours before the run. Between the navigator and the main spar sat the wireless operator, monitoring frequencies and listening for recalls and diversions. Standing beside the pilot, the flight engineer handled fuel transfer, engine temperatures and the aircraft systems, and in an emergency he became the second pair of hands on the control column. The mid-upper gunner occupied a perspex dome set into the aircraft's spine, turning through a full circle, watching the sky above and behind. And at the very back sat the rear gunner, alone in a turret facing backwards, cut off from the rest of the crew by the entire length of the fuselage. Crews called that position tail end Charlie, which sounds affectionate and described the most exposed and most dangerous seat in the aeroplane. Look at where those 7 men sat, because the geometry explains the casualty pattern. Pilot, flight engineer, navigator, wireless operator, and bomb aimer clustered forward, in and around the cockpit and the nose, which put 5 of the 7 inside roughly the front quarter of the aircraft. The mid-upper gunner sat in the spine, above and slightly behind the wing, while the rear gunner sat at the extreme tail, on his own. Now overlay the escape problem onto that layout. Inside a Lancaster, the route from the rear of the aircraft to the forward escape hatch ran the full length of the fuselage and over the main spar, the structural beam carrying the wing loads straight through the middle of the interior. A man in flying kit, wearing a bulky suit, boots and a parachute harness, in darkness, in a machine probably on fire and almost certainly not flying level, had to climb over that spar. Of the men who attempted to abandon a Lancaster, 10.9% survived it. The Halifax carried a wider fuselage with more accessible escape hatches, and 29.4% survived. Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris pressed for improved escape hatches after reading those operational research section reports, which is worth recording, because Harris rarely appears in these accounts as a man who studied a casualty report and acted on what it told him. The rear gunner's position compounded every part of the problem. Furthest from the exit, alone at the back of a burning tube, he sat in a turret that depended on hydraulics to rotate into the position allowing him to fall out backwards. When the hydraulics failed, the manual system stood as the backup, and when the manual system failed as well, the rear gunner was sealed into a perspex box at the back of a descending aircraft. That exact sequence of failures caught Flying Officer Pat Brophy of 419 Squadron on the night of the 12th and 13th of June 1944, and the reason it is documented in such precise detail is that Brophy lived to describe it. The rear gunner also inhabited a different climate from everyone else aboard. Oxygen became necessary above roughly 10,000 feet and operations ran far higher than that, while frostbite counted as routine in the rear turret. 6 or 7 hours were spent facing backwards into the airflow, watching the volume of sky the aircraft had just left, because that is the direction the night fighter comes from. Tail End Charlie described the least survivable seat in the least survivable branch of the entire Allied war effort. A tour of operations ran to 30 trips, and completing all 30 sent a man to instruct. A second tour added 20 more. From February 1943 onward, aircrew flying a second tour could not be classified as lacking moral fiber, a policy detail that will need its own explanation shortly. 30 operations was the number every crew counted toward. Now put a loss rate against that number. Across Royal Canadian Air Force Halifax operations between March 1943 and February 1944, the average loss rate ran at 6.05% per operation, according to the Bomber Command Museum of Canada. Carry 6.05% across 30 operations, and the survival rate for a full tour arrives at 16%. 16% was not the chance of being killed, but the chance of finishing. Murray Peaton, a Canadian pilot who wrote about the offensive afterwards, put it in a sentence nobody has improved on since, recording that at times during the great offensives of 1943 and 1944, the short-term statistics foretold that fewer than 25 out of every 100 crews would survive their first tour of 30 operations. Here is another cross-domain comparison, offered as an analogy and not as a historical claim. A loss rate expressed per operation behaves the way compound interest behaves, except it runs in the wrong direction. Nobody dies of a 6.05% loss rate on any given night, because on any given night 6.05% looks survivable, and to a 22-year-old it looks like reasonable odds. What kills you is never the nightly rate, but that rate compounded across 30 repetitions. This is the identical mathematical trap that makes people misjudge repeated small risks in almost every modern setting, from actuarial pricing to reliability engineering to a manufacturer working out that a component with a 99% per cycle success rate will still fail catastrophically across enough cycles. The individual event stays safe while the sequence turns lethal. Bomber Command aircrew who worked this out for themselves did it with pencils, in Nissen huts, and mostly stopped doing it out loud. Wider Bomber Command figures confirm what the number 6 group numbers show. The Royal Air Force Bomber Command Memorial in Green Park carries the figure of 55,573 aircrew killed out of approximately 125,000 who served, a death rate of 44.4%. Across the war the command flew 501,536 operational sorties, dropped approximately 1.02 million tons of bombs, and lost 8,325 aircraft in action. The Imperial War Museum states the breakdown differently, and the difference is instructive. Killed on operations were 51% of aircrew, with a further 12% killed or wounded in non-operational accidents, in training, in collisions, and on landing approaches in fog, while 13% became prisoners of war. Added together, that produces a casualty rate of roughly 76% among the 120,000 and more men who flew, meaning 3/4 were killed, wounded, or captured. Number 6 Group went operational on the 1st of January 1943 and walked directly into the hardest 12 months of the entire campaign. The Battle of the Ruhr opened on the night of the 5th and 6th of March 1943 and ran to the 31st of July, delivering nearly 5 months of concentrated attack against the most heavily defended industrial region in Europe, a belt of cities ringed with flak and searchlight batteries and covered by an integrated night fighter system. Number 6 Group put 2,649 sorties into the campaign and lost 145 aircraft, producing a loss rate of 5.5% against a Bomber Command campaign average of 4.7%. 0.8 percentage point sounds like nothing at all. Compound it across a tour and it becomes the difference between a crew room that empties slowly and one that empties fast. Across 1943, Number 6 Group carried the highest loss rates of any group in Bomber Command, which is the plain finding, and the reasons behind it are still argued over. 4 explanations usually get offered, and all 4 hold up. Equipment comes first, because Number 6 Group flew Wellingtons and early Mark Halifaxes while other groups converted to Lancasters, and the early Halifax Marks were genuinely inferior aircraft. Geography comes second, and this is the explanation most often left out. The group station sat in the Vale of York and County Durham, while almost every other Bomber Command group flew from further south. A Canadian crew lifting off from Skipton-on-Swale or Croft faced a longer flight to reach the target and a longer flight to get home, which meant more fuel, which meant less bomb load, and which meant more hours spent inside the German night fighter belt on both legs. That is a latency problem, and here it is stated explicitly as an analogy. Inside any modern distributed system, the node sitting furthest from its destination pays a penalty on every single transaction, a penalty invisible in any one transaction and enormous once aggregated. Northern basing imposed exactly that structure on the Canadian bomber effort, so every sortie carried a geographic tax that nobody paid consciously and every crew paid every night. Crew inexperience comes third, because No. 6 Group was a new formation absorbing new squadrons and new crews at speed through 1943, and inexperience kills faster than anything except bad luck. Training and leadership come fourth. That Operational Research Section report of July 1943 tied Halifax loss rates to training, and specifically to how the type behaved when thrown into hard maneuvers. Standard evasion against a night fighter was the corkscrew, a violent diving turn reversed over and over, and the early Halifax handled it badly, which meant a crew unable to corkscrew properly was a crew unable to evade. Squadron figures inside the group tell their own version of the story. 405 Squadron, the Vancouver Squadron, carried the highest loss rate of any unit in the group at 7.3%, while 419 Squadron, the Moose, flew the most sorties at 3,645 and lost 105 aircraft. Across its lifetime the group flew more than 40,000 sorties, and approximately 8,000 decorations for bravery went to its members, a figure cited by Veterans Affairs Canada on the 26th of August 2013. The historian John Boyleau added the wider point, noting that most of the more than 8,000 decorations awarded to the Royal Canadian Air Force went to men in Bomber Command. Decorations and casualties flowed from the same source, and no route existed to earn one without running the risk of the other. Those 11 stations deserve naming once more, because they formed the geography of the Canadian Bomber War and because that geography killed people. Middleton St. George, Linton-on-Ouse, Croft, Skipton-on-Swale, Tholthorpe, Leeming, Dishforth, Topcliffe, Eastmore, Dalton, and Wimbledon. Bomber Command organized those 11 airfields into 4 administrative bases, a structure built to concentrate maintenance, training, and administration, all of it directed from Allerton Park near Knaresborough, the 75-room house belonging to Lord Mowbray. The Vale of York and South County Durham lie further north than almost anywhere else Bomber Command operated from, and that single fact runs underneath the whole loss rate argument. Work through what northern basing does to a sortie and the penalty becomes visible. The aircraft must fly further to reach the target, and further means more fuel, and more fuel means either a heavier machine on takeoff or a smaller bomb load, usually some combination of both. The aircraft must then fly further home, adding hours on the return leg when the crew is exhausted. The aircraft may be damaged, and German night fighters are working the stream on its way back. Every one of those effects is small on its own, and all of them apply to every sortie, and No. 6 Group flew 40,822 of them. Set that beside the loss figures once more. During the Battle of the Ruhr the group lost 5.5% against a Bomber Command average of 4.7%, and nobody assigning airfields in 1942 intended to add 0.8 of a percentage point to the Canadian death rate. The airfields were simply where the airfields were. That is what a structural disadvantage looks like, because it is not a decision but a condition, invisible to everyone inside it, and it compounds. The other 3 explanations sit alongside the geographic one rather than replacing it, since the group flew older aircraft while other groups converted, absorbed new crews at speed, and struggled with an aircraft that turned unstable under the one maneuver that could save it. For causes, all real, all working on the same aircrew simultaneously, which is usually how these things operate, and which is why the single-cause version of the story is always wrong no matter which single cause somebody picks. One technical development in this period shifted the survival mathematics further than any airframe modification managed, and it arrived in the last week of July 1943. Operation Gemara, the Battle of Hamburg, ran from the 24th of July to the 3rd of August 1943, and it delivered the first major operational use of window. Window was metallized paper, cut into strips at a length matched to the wavelength of German radar and dropped in bundles from the bomber stream. Each strip returned a radar echo, and enough strips returned enough echoes to flood German screens with false contacts, which wrecked a night fighter control system that depended on ground controllers vectoring individual fighters onto individual bombers. The controllers could no longer tell which contacts were aircraft. Window worked immediately, and the German system took months to adapt to it. Here is another explicit analogy, offered as an analogy rather than a historical claim. Window functioned as a denial-of-service attack executed with paper, because the German air defense network was never destroyed, jammed in the conventional sense, or physically damaged. It was flooded. Presented with more inputs than it could process, the system lost its capacity to separate signal from noise, which is structurally the same failure that brings down a modern server under a flood of illegitimate requests. The defending system stayed fully functional and became useless. The countermeasure followed the same path in both cases as well. German commanders did not respond by building better radar, but by changing tactics, abandoning precise ground-controlled interception in favor of loosely directed free-hunting fighters put into the bomber stream to find targets visually. Modern network defense makes the identical adaptation when filtering fails, which is to stop trying to identify each individual request and start reasoning about the shape of the traffic as a whole. 3 Canadian squadrons missed Hamburg entirely, because numbers 420, 424 and 425 squadrons were sitting in Tunisia as 331 Wing, flying Wellington Mark 10 in support of Operation Husky, and they did not return to England until November 1943. In May 1943, right in the middle of the Battle of the Ruhr, No. 6 Group gave up 3 of its squadrons. 331 Wing, built from numbers 420, 424 and 425 squadrons, went on detachment to Northwest African Air Command in support of Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, flying Wellington Mark 10 from bases in Tunisia before returning to England in November 1943. 3 Canadian squadrons spent the summer of 1943 operating twin-engine bombers off North African airfields, including 425 Squadron, the Francophone Alouette. That is nowhere near the picture most people carry of the Canadian Bomber War, and it is precisely the kind of detail that disappears whenever a story gets compressed. On the night of the 17th and 18th of August 1943, Bomber Command attacked Peenemünde in Operation Hydra, and that raid is where a Canadian name enters the record at the highest level. The Pathfinder Force, No. 8 Group, existed to solve the problem sitting underneath everything else about the night offensive, which was that a stream of several hundred aircraft arriving over a blacked-out city in darkness had no dependable way of finding the aiming point. Pathfinders solved it by going in ahead and marking it. They flew first, located the target, and dropped colored markers for the main force to aim at, which meant arriving over a target that had not yet been attacked, against defenses that were fully alert and entirely undistracted. For 05 Squadron, the Vancouver Squadron, transferred from No. 6 Group to No. 8 Group and became the only Royal Canadian Air Force unit inside the Pathfinder Force. During its time with No. 6 Group it had also carried the highest loss rate of any squadron there, at 7.3%. Group Captain John Emilius Fauquier commanded 405 Squadron, and Fauquier had flown as a bush pilot in Canada before the war, which is relevant rather than decorative, because bush flying in Canada meant navigating over featureless terrain, in bad weather, without ground support, and bringing the aircraft back anyway. Fauquier flew as Deputy Master Bomber at Peenemünde on the night of the 17th and 18th of August 1943, and flew again as a marker leader at the opening of the Battle of Berlin in November of that year. The Master Bomber's role concentrated risk into one aircraft. He orbited the target for the length of the raid, judging where the markers had actually fallen and directing the incoming main force by radio to correct the aiming point, which meant remaining above a defended city for the duration of the attack rather than crossing it once and leaving. Fauquier finished the war holding the Distinguished Service Order with 2 bars, meaning that decoration came to him 3 times, along with the Distinguished Flying Cross. Then Fauquier did something with no obvious parallel anywhere in the campaign. Taking command of 617 Squadron of the Royal Air Force, the specialist precision unit known publicly as the Dambusters, meant accepting a reduction in rank from Air Commodore back to Group Captain, and Fauquier accepted it so that he could fly a 3rd operational tour. A first tour ran 30 operations at a 16% survival rate, and a second tour added 20 more. Fauquier surrendered a rank in order to go back for a 3rd. The men of No. 6 Group called him the King of the Pathfinders, and Fauquier is widely described as Canada's greatest bomber pilot. The Battle of Berlin opened in November 1943 and ran until March 1944. The Royal Air Force's own official history, written by Webster and Franklin, delivered a verdict on that campaign which no revisionist has managed to soften, recording that the Battle of Berlin amounted to more than a failure, and that it was a defeat. That judgment came from the Royal Air Force's own historians, writing about their own command, and it is worth holding on to when the argument about effectiveness arrives later. Berlin ended in March 1944, and in effect it ended on a single night. On the night of the 30th and 31st of March 1944, Bomber Command dispatched 795 aircraft against Nuremberg, a force made up of 572 Lancasters, 214 Halifaxes and 9 Mosquitoes. Conditions were wrong from the moment they lifted off, because the night stayed clear under a full moon, and the bombers laid unexpected condensation trails through the cold high air, drawing white lines across a moonlit sky for German night fighters to follow. Between 95 and 96 bombers were shot down, with total losses including aircraft written off on return reaching approximately 106 to 108, which comes to 11.9% of the force dispatched. Roughly 545 aircrew were killed and roughly 159 were taken prisoner. Nuremberg suffered comparatively light damage, and the raid is widely judged a failure. It remains the worst single-night bomber command experienced in the whole war. Now hold that one night's figure against the aggregate. Around 545 men died in a single night, while across the entire war No. 6 group lost somewhere between 4,203 and 4,272 dead. Nuremberg alone cost Bomber Command more than a tenth of what the whole Canadian group lost across 2 years and 8 months. The bomber offensive was never a slow attrition punctuated by disasters, because it functioned as a sequence of individual nights, each one a separate roll of the dice, and occasionally the roll came up catastrophic for reasons that had nothing to do with courage or skill and everything to do with a weather forecast and a moon phase. There is one detail that changes how the whole campaign looks, and it almost never surfaces in general accounts. Bomber Command's Operational Research Section studied what happened to crews who successfully abandoned a stricken aircraft, meaning not the crews killed outright in the air, but the ones who received the order, got out of their seats, and tried to leave. Abandoning a Lancaster produced a survival rate of 10.9%, while abandoning a Halifax produced 29.4%, which is nearly 3 times better. Aerodynamics had nothing to do with the gap, and neither did fire or how long the airframe held together, because the reason was architecture. The Halifax carried a wider fuselage with more accessible escape hatches, while the Lancaster carried a cramped fuselage and a main spar running straight through the middle of it, which a man in flying kit, in darkness, at -G, under fire, had to physically climb over to reach the exit. Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris pressed for improved escape hatches after reading those reports. This is a cross-domain connection, and it is offered explicitly as an analogy. What the Operational Research Section found at the escape hatch is what modern safety engineering calls a failure mode problem, and specifically a problem of egress design. By almost every operational measure the Lancaster was the better bomber, since it carried more, flew higher on the same power, and handled better, and every metric used to compare the two aircraft in 1943 favored it, because every one of those metrics measured the aircraft while it was working. Nobody was measuring either aircraft while it was failing. That is exactly the distinction modern reliability engineering draws between performance under nominal conditions and performance under fault conditions, and it explains why building codes specify exit widths rather than floor area, why aviation certification now measures evacuation time rather than cabin capacity, and why a system optimized entirely around its working state can turn lethal in its failing state. 18.5 percentage points separated the two aircraft at the moment of abandonment. Spread across the thousands of Bomber Command aircraft hit and abandoned during the war, that gap represents a specific and countable number of men who were alive when the order came and dead when the aircraft struck the ground, for reasons settled on a drawing board years earlier. Canadian relevance runs directly through it, since Halliday's figures give 3,675 Canadian deaths in Halifaxes and 3,349 in Lancasters, and No. 6 Group flew both. 3 letters follow Bomber Command through every retelling, and they stand for lack of moral fiber. The term surfaces in Royal Air Force meeting minutes on the 21st of March 1940 and was formalized in a document dated the 28th of September 1941, known as the Waiver Letter or the LMF Memorandum, applying to aircrew who refused to fly without a medical reason. Consequences were designed to humiliate rather than to punish. A man classified this way forfeited his flying badge and had his record stamped with a red W for waverer, while officers lost their commissions and non-commissioned officers were reduced to aircraftmen second class, the lowest rank in the service, and handed menial duties. Northwest court-martial took place, no charge was laid, and no appeal existed in the ordinary sense, because the system was built to shame. Officially the policy was dropped in 1945, though the term persisted informally into the 1960s. And this is where the received story needs correcting, because the numbers look nothing like the legend. Wing Commander James Lawson of the Air Ministry recorded them. Referrals covered 746 officers and 3,313 non-commissioned officers, and out of those referrals 2,726 cases were classified as lacking moral fiber, including 2,337 non-commissioned officers. Now here is the part almost nobody quotes, which is that only about 1/3 of those cases came from Bomber Command. Bomber Command is the command the term has become synonymous with, appearing in every film, every novel, and every documentary that touches the subject, and Bomber Command accounted for roughly 1/3 of the total. Dr. Ellen of the International Bomber Command Center puts the scale into proportion, estimating that only around 200 aircrew a year, out of 125,000 who served, were classified as lacking moral fiber. 200 a year, inside a force where 44.4% of the men were killed. The policy operated on a far smaller scale than its mythology suggests, by a very wide margin, and that does not make it defensible so much as make it something different from what it usually gets presented as. It is normally described as a system that broke thousands of men, when what it appears to have been was a deterrent applied rarely and discussed constantly, with the discussion doing the work. From February 1943 onward, aircrew on a second tour could not be classified this way at all, because a men who had already survived 30 operations had, by the system's own reckoning, proved whatever needed proving. The scholarly reference for how all of this landed on Canadian aircrew specifically is Alan D. English's book The Cream of the Crop, Canadian Aircrew 1939–1945, published by McGill Queen's University Press in 1996. Air Vice Marshal Clifford Mackay McEwen took command of No. 6 Group on the 29th of February 1944, 3 weeks before the Nuremberg raid. Known throughout the group as Black Mike, McEwen arrived carrying a single conviction, which was that the group's losses amounted to a training problem before they amounted to an equipment problem. The group's loss ratio afterwards fell into line with the other groups of Bomber Command, and that improvement is credited in part to McEwen's rigorous training regime. That deserves sitting with for a moment. In 1943 the group suffered the worst loss rates in Bomber Command, and by the later stages of the war it was losing aircraft at rates comparable to everybody else. Equipment improved across that period, with the Halifax Mark III and its Bristol Hercules radials replacing the earlier Marks and Lancasters arriving, including Canadian-built Mark X aircraft off the Victory aircraft line at Malton, while the tactical situation shifted after the invasion. All of that is true. The training changed as well, under a commanding officer who decided that the gap between a crew able to corkscrew properly and a crew unable to do it was the gap between a squadron that emptied and a squadron that did not. On the night of the 12th and 13th of June 1944, 6 days after the invasion of Normandy, Lancaster KB-726, Squadron Code VRA of 419 Moose Squadron, lifted off to attack the railway yards at Cambrai in northern France. It was the crew's 13th operation. 7 men flew that night. Flying Officer Art de Brain held the pilot's seat, with Flying Officer Bob Bodie navigating, Pilot Officer Jack Friday as bomb aimer, Pilot Officer Jim Kelly on the wireless, Flight Sergeant Roy Vigas as flight engineer, Pilot Officer Andrew Charles Minarski in the mid-upper turret and Flying Officer Pat Brophy in the rear. Andrew Minarski had been born in Winnipeg on the 14th of October 1916. Before the flight, Minarski found a 4-leaf clover and gave it to Pat Brophy. A German night fighter attacked, both port engines failed, fire broke out in the fuselage, and Flying Officer de Brain gave the order to abandon the aircraft. Minarski left his turret and moved toward the rear escape hatch, which was the correct action and the one that would have saved his life. Looking back down the fuselage, Minarski saw Pat Brophy trapped in the rear turret, where the hydraulic system had failed and the manual system had failed along with it, leaving Brophy unable to get out. Minarski turned around and crawled aft through the fire. Reaching the turret, Mynarski attacked it with a fire axe, trying to break Brophy free, and while he worked his parachute caught fire and his clothing caught fire with it. Brophy waved him off. Andrew Mynarski came to attention as well as any man can inside the fuselage of a burning Lancaster, saluted Pat Brophy, and jumped with his clothing ablaze. French civilians on the ground found him, and Andrew Mynarski died of his burns. Pat Brophy survived. The Lancaster struck the ground, and the impact broke the rear turret open and threw Brophy clear, which meant the thing Mynarski had died attempting to do was accomplished, in the crudest way imaginable, by the crash itself. Brophy came back to England through the French resistance in September 1944 and testified to what Mynarski had done. Nobody else had seen any of it, because every other man had already jumped, so the entire account of Mynarski's last 12 minutes exists only because the men he failed to save lived to describe them. Andrew Charles Mynarski received the Victoria Cross posthumously in 1946, on Brophy's testimony, becoming the first member of the Royal Canadian Air Force decorated with the Victoria Cross in the Second World War. He lies in Meharicourt Communal Cemetery in France. The fire axe survives, held by 419 Squadron at Canadian Forces Base Cold Lake, while Mynarski's Victoria Cross is displayed at 1 Canadian Air Division headquarters in Winnipeg. A statue stands at Middleton St. George, unveiled in 2005, and another in Winnipeg, unveiled in 2015. Two other Canadians in the Air War received the Victoria Cross in 1944, and both are routinely described inaccurately. Flight Lieutenant David Ernest Hornell was born in Mimico, Ontario, on the 26th of January 1910, and flew with 162 Bomber Reconnaissance Squadron of the Royal Canadian Air Force, in Coastal Command rather than Bomber Command. That distinction is not pedantry, because it separates two entirely different air campaigns. On the 24th of June 1944, Hornell's Canso flying boat attacked and sank the submarine U-1225, and the aircraft was destroyed in the process. Hornell survived the ditching and died of exposure after roughly 21 hours adrift. Hornell's became the first Royal Canadian Air Force Victoria Cross of the war to be gazetted. Mynarski's action on the night of the 12th and 13th of June 1944 came earlier in the same month, but his award waited until 1946, because the only witness spent those intervening months escaping through occupied France. That is why the phrase First Royal Canadian Air Force Victoria Cross attaches to both men and misleads for both of them. Mynarski's action came earlier, Hornell's award came earlier. Mynarski flew in Bomber Command and Hornell flew in Coastal Command. Hornell lies buried at Lerwick in the Shetland Islands. The third was Squadron Leader Ian Willoughby Bazalgette, born in Calgary on the 19th of October 1918. Bazalgette flew with the Royal Air Force rather than the Royal Canadian Air Force, serving with No. 635 Squadron in No. 8 Group, the Pathfinder Force, and flying as a master bomber. On the 4th of August 1944, Bazalgette attacked V-1 storage caves at Tracy-Saint-Maximin, and it was his 58th operation. A previous tour of 28 operations already stood behind him, along with the Distinguished Flying Cross awarded in 1943. Bazalgette's Victoria Cross was gazetted on the 14th of August 1945, his grave is at Senantes in France, and the decoration itself is held at the Royal Air Force Museum at Hendon. Consider what that means in practice. A Canadian-born officer of the Royal Air Force, flying with a British Pathfinder Squadron, on his 58th trip, when a tour ran 30 operations and the survival rate for a single tour sat at 16%. On the 6th of June 1944 the bomber offensive changed shape entirely. Bomber Command turned away from the German industrial cities toward tactical support of the Normandy campaign, and 37 Royal Canadian Air Force squadrons supported the landings across all commands. Through most of 1943 the argument about Bomber Command had centered on whether attacking cities worked at all. From June 1944 the command spent months hitting railway junctions, coastal batteries, troop concentrations, fuel dumps and V-weapon sites, which is precisely what Bazalgette was doing at Tracy-Saint-Maximin on the 4th of August and what the crew of KB-726 was doing over the Cambrai marshalling yards on the 12th of June. Andrew Mynarski did not die attacking a city. Mynarski died attacking a railway yard in France, 6 days after the invasion, in direct support of the armies fighting on the ground. That fact sits awkwardly beside the way Bomber Command's Canadian dead usually get discussed, and it belongs in the record regardless. Bombers returned to Germany later in the campaign, and on the night of the 13th and 14th of February 1945 No. 6 Group took part in the attack on Dresden, one of a series of raids running from the 13th to the 15th of February. Sergeant Frank Bramley, a mid-upper gunner with 431 Iroquois Squadron, described what the crews saw as they left the target, saying that when they departed the fires burned more intensely than ever, and that he doubted any of the Nazis below would need much anti-war education once it was all over. That is a Canadian gunner, in the aircraft, on the night, and it stands as the closest thing this account holds to a direct answer about what the men themselves believed they were doing. The dispute over the bomber offensive did not begin with historians in the 1960s, because it began while the bombers were still flying, at the highest level of the British war effort, and the surviving document carries the date of the 28th of March 1945. On that day the British Prime Minister sent a minute to the Chiefs of Staff and to Air Chief Marshal Sir Charles Portal, the Chief of the Air Staff, and the full text appears in Martin Gilbert's biography, in the volume Road to Victory, at page 1257. That minute stated that the moment had arrived when the question of bombing German cities simply for the sake of increasing the terror, though under other pretexts, should be reviewed. It stated that the destruction of Dresden remained a serious query against the conduct of Allied bombing, and it stated a preference for more precise concentration upon military objectives such as oil and communications behind the immediate battle zone, rather than upon mere acts of terror and wanton destruction, however impressive. The minute gets quoted constantly, while what followed it almost never does. Portal objected to it as unfair to Bomber Command. The minute was withdrawn, and a milder version was substituted on approximately the 1st of April 1945. A document that history quotes as a moral reckoning was retracted inside 4 days at the insistence of the men commanding the Air Force. 2 further corrections belong here, because both errors circulate widely. The minute is frequently dated to the 28th of February 1945, when the authoritative date, according to Gilbert, is the 28th of March. And the most famous sentence associated with Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris gets misquoted almost every time it appears. Harris said the Nazis entered the war under the rather childish delusion that they were going to bomb everyone else while nobody was going to bomb them, that at Rotterdam, London, Warsaw, and half a hundred other places they put that rather naive theory into operation, that they sowed the wind, and now they were going to reap the whirlwind. The closing image comes from the book of Hosea, chapter 8, verse 7. The list runs Rotterdam, London, and Warsaw, and Coventry does not appear anywhere in it, though the Coventry version is the one that has propagated. Even the venue and date remain disputed among popular sources, with some placing the statement on BBC Radio on the 28th of July 1942 and others in a newsreel filmed shortly after Harris took command in February of that year. Harris set out his own reasoning in an internal memorandum after Dresden in February 1945, writing that attacks on cities, like any other act of war, are intolerable unless they are strategically justified, and that they become justified insofar as they tend to shorten the war and preserve the lives of Allied soldiers. Harris added that he did not personally regard the whole of the remaining cities of Germany as worth the bones of one British grenadier. That is the argument in its hardest form, stated by the men responsible, in writing, at the time. The effectiveness question carries 2 serious answers, and this account will give both of them. The case for the offensive runs like this. Bombing tied down enormous German resources, committing flak batteries, night fighters, radar installations, manpower, ammunition production, and the concrete and steel of air defense to protecting German airspace instead of fighting on any front. It disrupted production, and in the later stages of the war it disrupted oil and transport specifically and severely. For a long stretch of the war it offered the only means by which Germany could be struck directly at all, and supporters hold that it shortened the war while easing pressure on Soviet forces in the East and Allied armies in the West. General Paul Manson, retired, argued the moral half of the case head-on, saying that claiming the campaign's intent was to bomb the centers of cities and kill as many civilians as possible simply does not ring true. The case against runs like this. Area bombing killed approximately 600,000 German civilians and left more than 5 million homeless, while producing only small reductions in German war production until late in the war. Critics press effectiveness and morality together, on the grounds that a campaign aimed at civilian morale is a campaign aimed at civilians. Post-war surveys never settled any of it. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey and the British Bombing Survey Unit both examined what the bombing had actually done to the German economy, and both delivered mixed verdicts, with neither producing the clean answer either side wanted. That ambiguity has kept the argument running for 80 years through revisionist and counter-revisionist scholarship, in work by Richard Overy, David Bercuson, Alan English, and David Bahow among others, and in the Canadian Official History, The Crucible of War, 1939 to 1945, the third volume of the Official History of the Royal Canadian Air Force, published in 1994 by Greenhouse, Harris, Johnston, and Rawling. Here is why the argument does not resolve, put as plainly as it can be put. Both sides are working from the same evidence, and the two central claims are both true. Saying the bombing had limited effect on German war production until late in the war and saying the bombing tied down enormous German defensive resources are not statements in tension, because they measure different things. Production output is one metric and resource diversion is another. A campaign can fail to stop factories running while succeeding in forcing an enemy to commit flak batteries, night fighters, radar installations, ammunition, concrete, and hundreds of thousands of men to defending airspace rather than fighting on a front. Those defensive resources never appear in a production output table, because they represent output redirected rather than output reduced. The Canadian War Museum panel of 2007 stated that the raids produced only small reductions in German war production until late in the war, which is accurate as far as production goes and is also not a complete accounting of the campaign's effect. That incompleteness was the substance of what the veterans were objecting to, even though the objection came out sounding like a purely moral one. The case for the offensive also rests on a point about timing that is easy to lose. No second front existed in Western Europe until June 1944, which meant the bomber offensive was, for years, the entire Western Allied capacity to carry the war onto German territory. And the Royal Air Force's own official historians, Webster and Frankland, wrote that the Battle of Berlin was more than a failure and that it was a defeat. 3 positions sit on the table, one from a wartime commander, one from a retired Canadian general, and one from the Royal Air Force's own history. None of the 3 can be dismissed as ignorant of the evidence, and that is the shape of the disagreement, which is why it has never ended. The men who flew are not a party to that argument, because the men who flew were told where to go and went, and between 9,919 and 10,855 of them, depending on the count, did not come back from it. The last 2 things Bomber Command did in Europe are the 2 things almost nobody knows about, and both are worth setting against everything above. Operation Manna ran from the 29th of April 1945 to the night of the 7th and 8th of May. Bomber Command aircraft flew over the occupied Netherlands and dropped food to a civilian population that was starving, using the same aircraft, the same crews and the same bomb bays. Operation Exodus ran from the 3rd of April 1945 to the 31st of May, with Bomber Command aircraft repatriating approximately 75,000 British former prisoners of war, flying them home from the continent. Consider that sequence from the position of a single Canadian crew. In February 1945 that crew was over Dresden. By late April the same crew was flying at low level across Dutch fields, pushing sacks of flour out of the aircraft. By May the same crew was carrying men home from prison camps. 3 completely different missions inside roughly 90 days, in the same aeroplane. The Second World War ended in Europe on the 8th of May 1945, and No. 6 Group was formally stood down on the 31st of August. A contingent was being organized for Tiger Force, the intended Commonwealth bomber force for operations against Japan, and the war ended before that contingent ever deployed. Then the men came home, and for most of the rest of their lives they formed the only major branch of the Allied air effort with no campaign award of its own. Fighter Command Aircrew received the Battle of Britain clasp in 1945, the Dieppe and Hong Kong clasps were instituted in 1994, and Coastal Command Aircrew qualified for the Atlantic Star after 60 days of service. Bomber Command received nothing at all, with no clasp, no bar and no campaign star specific to the offensive. Men who had flown 30 operations at a 16% survival rate wore the same general service awards as men who had never left England. That grievance ran for decades, and it was never really about medal. In Canada it produced one of the sharpest public disputes between veterans and a national institution in the country's post-war history. Through 2007 the Second World War Gallery of the Canadian War Museum carried a panel headed An Enduring Controversy, running to 68 words and accompanied by photographs of German dead in bombed streets. The text stated that the value and morality of the strategic bomber offensive against Germany remains bitterly contested. It stated that Bomber Command's aim was to crush civilian morale and force Germany to surrender by destroying its cities and industrial installations. And it stated that although Bomber Command and American attacks left 600,000 Germans dead and more than 5 million homeless, the raids resulted in only small reductions in German war production until late in the war. Veterans and the Royal Canadian Legion argued that the wording implied the bomber crews had been war criminals. Don Elliott, a navigator who flew in the offensive, said the wording made his fellow airmen look like war criminals. The dispute climbed all the way to Parliament. Hearings ran before the Standing Senate Subcommittee on Veterans Affairs in the spring of 2007, chaired by Senator Joseph A. Day, with Norman K. Atkins as deputy chair and Colin Kenny sitting on it, while Romeo Dallaire participated in the proceedings alongside the historians Randall Hansen and Serge Bernier. Reporting came in June 2007, in a document sometimes called the 16th Report and sometimes the An Enduring Controversy Interim Report. The finding was an unusual one, because the subcommittee ruled that the veterans had misinterpreted the panel and that the panel was factual, and then recommended changing it anyway. The report described the affair as an unfortunate public dispute, and framed the disagreement in a sentence worth repeating precisely, stating that the veterans' argument is based on fact and emotion, while the Canadian War Museum's stand is based on fact and academic objectivity. The historians did not go quietly. Jack Granatstein and Margaret Macmillan defended the original wording as factual, with Macmillan calling the decision to change it a sad day for museums. David Berkusen took a narrower line, arguing that the accompanying photographs misled, since they showed destruction on the ground rather than, for instance, grounded German aircraft. Museum officials initially resisted, with Mark O'Neill and Dean Oliver among those holding the position that the panel was accurate, while General Paul Manson, retired, chaired the museum's War Museum Committee and supported a compromise. In late August 2007 the museum agreed to change the text, and revised, longer wording went up in October. The new version added context the original had left out, including the public support the campaign enjoyed among the Allies at the time, the terrible losses suffered by the aircrew themselves, and the sharp fall in German industrial output late in the war. Veterans approved the new text, while some historians regarded the outcome as a capitulation to pressure. Both readings survive intact. A museum revised a factual panel under public and parliamentary pressure, and a group of aged veterans persuaded an institution to acknowledge, inside the same 68-word space that described what they had destroyed, what doing it had cost them. Canada resolved the medal question in 2013. Creation of the Bomber Command Bar to the Canadian Volunteer Service Medal was announced on the 15th of April 2013 by Ministers Stephen Blaney and Peter MacKay, with the first presentation taking place in Toronto on the 26th of August, handled by Minister Julian Fantino, and further ceremonies following in September in Ottawa and Halifax. The eligibility rule is the part that matters most. Any Canadian who had earned the Canadian Volunteer Service Medal and served at least one day with Bomber Command between the 3rd of September 1939 and the 8th of May 1945 qualified, regardless of rank and regardless of role, and ground crew were included. That decision reflected something the aircrew had always understood and the public rarely does. Men who armed the bombs, patched the flak holes, changed Hercules and Merlin engines in the open air through a Yorkshire winter, and stood on the perimeter track counting aircraft back in belonged to the same command. Veterans Affairs Canada framed it in the language the veterans used themselves, that the successes of Bomber Command started on the ground and finished in the air. The Women's Division belonged to that count as well. In January 1945, 1,450 members of the Royal Canadian Air Force Women's Division were serving with Royal Canadian Air Force Overseas Headquarters and with No. 6 Group Headquarters and its stations, and across the war 17,038 women served in the Women's Division altogether, according to the Juno Beach Centre. One consequence of Canada creating its own award is administrative and slightly strange. The United Kingdom introduced its own Bomber Command clasp to the 1939-45 star, also in 2013, and Canadian veterans are not eligible for the British clasp, because Canada issues its own bar and duplication is not permitted, a position Veterans Affairs Canada states directly. Canada and Britain each honored the same men 70 years late, and then had to agree on which of the two honors each man was allowed to keep. Before closing, it is worth being precise about the numbers, because that range of 9,000 10,919 to 10,855 is the single most misused statistic in the whole subject. Those figures are not competing estimates of one quantity. They are accurate counts of different quantities. The Crucible of War, the official history, gives 9,919, and the historian Richard Overy uses the same number. The Juno Beach Center relays it and adds context, noting that the figure represents 3/4 of the Royal Canadian Air Force's 13,498 wartime casualties, which makes it the strict count of Royal Canadian Air Force airmen who died serving with Bomber Command. 427 Squadron's own history gives 9,980. Veterans Affairs Canada and the Government of Canada use approximately 10,000 as the standard rounded figure. The Bomber Command Museum of Canada puts its best estimate at 10,400, and the museum is explicit about why the number sits higher, since it takes in Americans serving in the Royal Canadian Air Force along with training deaths and prisoner of war deaths. Defining Moments Canada says more than 10,600, counting Royal Air Force and Royal Canadian Air Force squadrons together and folding in operational, accident and training deaths. The Royal Air Force Bomber Command Memorial in Green Park carries the figure of 10,659 Canadians out of the total 55,573. And Canada's Bomber Command Virtual Memorial at Nanton holds 10,855 names, of which 449 belong to Americans who joined the Royal Canadian Air Force before the United States entered the war. Every one of those figures is defensible, and the differences come down to 3 questions nobody ever put to the men about themselves. Does a Canadian who flew in a Royal Air Force squadron count, given that roughly half the dead fall into that category, at 4,906 against 4,255, which moves the total by thousands either way? Does a man killed at an operational training unit in England, before he ever reached a squadron count, which covers 1,498 men, or 14%? Does an American who crossed the border to join the Royal Canadian Air Force before his own country entered the war count as a Canadian loss? Because at Nanton the answer is yes, and that answer accounts for 449 of the 10,855 names on the wall. None of those are statistical questions. They are questions about who belongs to a country, asked about men who are no longer available to be consulted, and Canada has answered them differently in different places at different times. The honest way to state the figure is to state the range along with the reason for it. Approximately 10,000, and here is why the number refuses to hold still. The physical record of the Canadian bomber effort now survives in a handful of places. The Royal Air Force Bomber Command Memorial in Green Park, London, was unveiled on the 28th of June 2012 by Queen Elizabeth II, during her Diamond Jubilee year. Liam O'Connor designed it, and Philip Jackson sculpted the bronze at its center, a 7-man crew, standing. The memorial carries the figure of 55,573. There is Canadian metal in the roof of that memorial, and the story of how it got there runs backwards through this entire account. Halifax LW682 of 426 Thunderbird Squadron was shot down in 1944 and crashed into a Belgian swamp, and the aircraft came out of that swamp decades later. Some of the aluminium went into the restoration of the Halifax now standing at Trenton, Ontario, while the metal that could not be used was melted into ingots, and some of those ingots were worked into the roof of the Bomber Command Memorial in Green Park, provided by the Bomber Command Museum of Canada. A Canadian bomber that went into a Belgian swamp in 1944 now forms part of the structure standing over the memorial in London. The International Bomber Command Centre opened at Canwick Hill outside Lincoln, with a soft public opening in late January 2018 and an official ceremony on the 12th of April, timed to the Royal Air Force centenary, drawing approximately 3,000 people including around 300 veterans. The centre holds the memorial spire, which at 31 meters stands as the tallest war memorial in the United Kingdom, alongside the Walls of Names, the Chadwick Centre and the Peace Gardens, with records covering losses from 1936 to 1968. The Bomber Command Museum of Canada at Nanton, Alberta, was founded in 1986 and holds Lancaster Mark 10 FM159, marked F2T in honor of Ian Bazalgette, one of 17 surviving Lancasters anywhere in the world. FM159 does not fly, though all 4 engines are operational and the aircraft taxis under its own power. The final engine ran for the first time on the 23rd of August 2013, which made FM 159 one of only 4 Lancasters anywhere with all 4 engines running. That same museum maintains Canada's Bomber Command Virtual Memorial, carrying 10,855 names, including the 449 Americans who joined the Royal Canadian Air Force before the United States entered the war. And then there is FM 213. Lancaster Mark 10 FM 213 came off the Victory aircraft line at Malton, Ontario in April 1945, too late for the war. Post-war service with the Royal Canadian Air Force ended with the aircraft standing as a gate guardian at Goderich, Ontario, before donation to the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum in 1977, an airlift out in 1979, and a return to flight in September 1988. FM 213 flies painted as KB726, Squadron Code VRA, which was Andrew Mynarski's aircraft. Only 2 airworthy Lancasters exist in the world, and the other is PA-474 of the Royal Air Force Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. PA-474 entered a major overhaul of roughly 18 months on the 29th of October 2025 and is expected back in late 2027, which means that through 2026 FM 213 is expected to be the only Lancaster flying anywhere on Earth. The last flying Lancaster in the world is Canadian, and it wears the markings of an aircraft that burned over Cambrai in June 1944. Return now to the number this began with. Between 9,919 and 10,855 Canadians died in RAF Bomber Command, and the range has been accounted for, because the boundaries are the reason, and those boundaries were drawn afterwards by people who were not there. Consider what the Canadian bomber effort looked like as one continuous system, from end to end. It started in December 1939 with a signature in Ottawa, ran through 107 schools and 231 sites and 104,113 staff and 10,906 aircraft and $2.23 billion, and produced 131,553 aircrew, 72,835 of them Canadian. Those men shipped to England, where roughly half were absorbed into British squadrons and the rest into Canadian ones, with the Canadian ones concentrated into a single group on 11 airfields in the Vale of York, run from a country house at Allerton Park. That group flew 40,822 sorties, dropped 126,122 tons of bombs, lost 814 aircraft, and earned approximately 8,000 decorations for bravery. At the far end of the system, roughly 10,000 men did not come back, a third of them into graves that were never found, their names cut into stone at Runnymede because nothing else remained to put anywhere. And then the system stopped. Number 6 Group stood down on the 31st of August 1945, the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan had already closed on the 31st of March, and the Tiger Force contingent never deployed. Squadrons carrying the Moose and the Porcupine and the Snowy Owl on their badges were dissolved, and the men who had flown in them went home to a country that had built the largest air training enterprise in its history and then dismantled the whole thing inside a year. What followed was silence, and then argument. 68 words on a museum panel in Ottawa in 2007 restarted a fight that had been running since a minute was drafted and withdrawn in London in March 1945. A Senate subcommittee heard it, historians published on it, and the panel was rewritten in October 2007. A bar to a service medal was created in April 2013 and first presented in Toronto on the 26th of August, 70 years after the Battle of the Ruhr, to men in their late 80s and 90s, on the rule that 1 day of service with Bomber Command qualified them. 1 day, after 70 years of nothing. Set against all of that, remember what the men themselves were handed. They flew from Yorkshire because Yorkshire was where the airfields happened to be, and paid a fuel and exposure penalty on every single sortie for the privilege. They flew Halifaxes in 1943 that could not corkscrew properly, and 3,675 of them died in Halifaxes. They flew Lancasters that were better in every measurable way except the one that mattered once the aircraft caught fire, and 3,349 of them died in Lancasters. A system produced 131,553 aircrew and killed 856 of them before they ever left Canada. They finished 30 operations at odds of 16%, and a good number of them then volunteered for 20 more. Andrew Minarski was 27 years old and held a four-leaf clover in his hand about an hour before he gave it away. The argument over whether any of it was worth doing has now run longer than the lives of most of the men it concerns. Royal Air Force official historians called the Battle of Berlin a defeat. The commander-in-chief wrote that he did not regard the remaining cities of Germany as worth the bones of one British grenadier. The Prime Minister drafted a minute questioning the entire campaign on the 28th of March 1945 and withdrew it 4 days later. A museum in Ottawa wrote 68 true sentences about it in 2007 and then had to rewrite them. None of that was ever put to a 19-year-old from Saskatchewan sitting backwards in a perspex box at 20,000 feet, in cold he could not measure, watching the dark for the thing that was already behind him. He was told the target and the takeoff time, and that was the whole of it. The rest arrived 70 years later, and by then most of the men it concerned had no way left to answer.